Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I can see that the attendee list appears to have stabilized. So welcome to this press conference, an opportunity to engage with this detention review panel into the detention conditions and the legal support and appropriateness of the detention arrangements for former Crown Prince Muhammed bin Nayef and Prince Ahmed bin Abdul Aziz in Saudi Arabia. My name is Chris Blunt. I'm a Member of Parliament for Reigate in Surrey. I'm a former chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons between 2015 and 2017. And subsequent to that, I have chaired two similar panels to this, one into the detention conditions of former Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi, and at the beginning of 2019, with panelist Layla Moran and the former Member of Parliament, Dr. Paul Williams, we conducted a detention review panel into 8 Saudi women's rights activists who had been detained at that stage. So, and the support we have from Tim Maloney as one of our lawyers and A.D. Dickstall. Tim Maloney was with the panel on the previous 2 occasions, along with the secretary to the panel, Taib Ali. But I'm delighted with the fact that we've been able, someone has instructed us to look into the detention conditions of these 2 most high-profile Saudi citizens, not least for the disturbing stories and rumors around their detention, because having been arrested, they have to all intents and purposes publicly disappeared from view, and that has its own concern about whether they're getting proper access to their families and to their lawyers and the rest, but also the implications for what that means for everyone else in Saudi Arabia. Now, I come to this as a long-standing supporter of good Saudi-British relations. I may even have lost the chairmanship of the Foreign Affairs Committee because of the robust stance I took over supporting continued British defence exports to Saudi Arabia, and welcoming the role that Saudi Arabia was taking in the region of picking up regional leadership in regards of the unanimous view of the United Nations Security Council about the situation in the Yemen when there was a coup against the then sitting president. So this is a panel, I believe, in which Saudi Arabia can have confidence, but also the wider international human rights community who will be observing what we do as well. And it's my privilege, therefore, to introduce my fellow panelists. Layla Moran, who served on our last panel, has been the Member of Parliament for Oxford, West and Abingdon since 2015, if I've got the dates.
2017.
2017. I do. You seem as though the impression you've made in Parliament.
I'm a veteran.
Great. But importantly for us, recently Layla obviously contested the leadership position for the Liberal Democrats, and while she didn't quite win, she was rightly rewarded, not least on the basis of her terrific international experience with the foreign affairs portfolio for the Liberal Democrats. So to have a Liberal Democrat front bench foreign affairs spokesman on the panel obviously adds authority to our conclusions and our work. And Layla, thank you very much for taking up this position. And I'm delighted to be joined by my Conservative colleague, Imran Ahmed Khan, who is the MP for Wakefield, has been in Parliament since the last general election, but brings to Parliament all his international affairs experience and work with the United Nations and experience working with the British Foreign Office as well. And completing a trio of panelists who have a particularly internationalist outlook on life, as well as, I think, robust support for proper values underpinning the conduct of international relations and as well as domestic human rights. We're advised by Tim Maloney, Queen's Counsel, who is from the Doughty Street Chambers. He is an international criminal law and international human rights specialist and has worked with me and Tayeb Ali on all three, or now this will be the third panel that we have worked together with him. And he is being, his legal colleague is Adi Dikshtal, who is again another specialist in international criminal law and international human rights law. Let me just very briefly then put the context for this panel. As I've said, the focus on these two gentlemen really sits about all political detainees in Saudi Arabia. What message does it send if people of this distinction in Saudi society find themselves detained and disappeared? Now, there is plainly a debate going on in Saudi Arabia about how Saudi Arabia is to recover from its self-acknowledged disaster of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi just 2 years ago. And our detention review panel that followed only 3 months after that catastrophic event for Saudi Arabia may explain why on that occasion the Saudi authorities were not in a position to engage with us. I think 2 years on, I'm hopeful, not least with the informal engagement from the Saudi ambassador, the new Saudi ambassador in London, with me on Monday, where he wanted, I think, to have an informal conversation with me, having received our formal letter asking for the cooperation of the Saudi authorities to make his own assessment about me and the panel. And that's an entirely proper way to proceed before he then gives advice to his own government about whether or not we can provide an opportunity for Saudi Arabia to present the actuality of the situation that it's managing, and for Saudi Arabia to be able to get across in an authoritative way to parliamentarians who would take particular care of their reputation in this regard, both the value of Britain's relationship with Saudi Arabia and the values that Britain stands for, that could have confidence in any conclusions that we come to. So this is an opportunity for Saudi Arabia, and I'm grateful for the way in which we have been engaged with so far. I realize it's early days, but the signs are significantly more encouraging that there is a proper conversation to be had with the Saudi authorities, and to provide them with the opportunity that I believe this panel presents for the Saudi side of the story to be told. Around the world, there are far, far too many people who will believe the worst of Saudi Arabia. As a British conservative, I know precisely how that feels, and the attitude of much of the press and population, and indeed our own Prime Minister, is sometimes judgmental and unfair. And it is very important that there are people who are going to stand up for the truth, and I hope that this panel will have the opportunity to do precisely that. And so with great pleasure, let me invite Layla Moran to make some opening remarks.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Crispin. Thank you all for attending, and it's a great pleasure to be part of another panel led ably by Crispin. The panel that I was involved in, the detention review panel in February 2019, was incredibly eye-opening. It was the first time that I had engaged with a lot of the detail of how political prisoners are handled in Saudi Arabia. And I will say now what I said then, which is that I come to this panel with the same open mind as I did with the last. As Crispin has alluded to and said, my position now is as Foreign Affairs spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats. Top of my agenda across the world is international law and human rights. And all I want is for any person anywhere in the world to know that if their human rights are being infringed upon in any way, that people are watching, and that we are going to raise the profile of these cases. And you could ask, well, what does a Lib Dem care about, two princes in Saudi Arabia? Well, I think the fact that they are potentially not being allowed to be seeing their family, not being allowed to be seeing, very importantly, their doctors at a time of coronavirus, then speaks volumes about what it could be like for others who are being detained in Saudi Arabia. And we saw very recently comments from Lujain al-Halthloul's family saying that she had been on hunger strike and hadn't been allowed to see her for months, and finally were allowed to visit on, I believe it was the end of August. But that, given that that's her, someone with a very high profile, here are two princes with very high profiles, this is happening to them. What is this like now for other people? And so that's the approach that I'm taking. I think it's really, really important that in the context of the G20 coming up with Saudi Arabia chairing, that they know that we are here to engage, that we are here to hold them and other countries indeed to account should they be not meeting their human rights obligations, but to do it in a way that is friendly, and to do it in a way that is respectful. And I should say, I'm very, very encouraged, and I would like to thank the Saudi ambassador for having engaged already with Crispin. That is more than we had in the last panel, and I think will make a real difference to this one. I hope that that positive relationship continues. But we will go where the evidence takes us. And so we will get as far down the truth as we possibly can. And the more evidence that we can have, the more openness, more engagement we can get from Saudi Arabia, the easier this process will be. And I hope that, you know, all this time after Jamal Khashoggi's murder, and then the panel that we held back in February 2018, a lot of time has passed, and it is difficult times for everyone across the world. But I hope that they are willing and wanting to show that there has been progress made, and that they have indeed moved in the right direction. And that's what I'm hoping to get out of this panel. Thank you very much.
Leila, thank you very much. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Imran Ahmed Khan, a newly elected colleague. And I ought to point out the strength of his background that he brings to this panel, even though a new member of Parliament. If someone of 23 years in Parliament is allowed to say that by someone who is nearly completing their first year without being sounding too wretchedly patronising. But Imran has worked for the UN, he's worked for NATO, he's worked for the Pentagon, he's worked for both the British and American governments, and in being an expert around the threat of extremism and terrorism in his career, gives a particular authority to the panel around the causes of extremism and terrorism, and respect for human rights in the administration of justice by nations around the world rips out any moral or conceivable legal authority from those who think they are entitled then to turn to extremism and violence in order to pursue their political ends. So governance and respect for the rule of law is absolutely central in those battles. And I would just I'd like to invite Imran to make some observations of his own. Imran.
Well, thank you, Crispin. And despite your very kind words, I'm going to approach this entire process with humility. I know I've got an awful lot to learn from Crispin and Leila, from their experience, and indeed about the issues that we're going to be examining. I have no preset conclusions or ideas, and I haven't prejudged the issues. I suppose my feelings towards Saudi Arabia can be characterized as being, in every measure, pregnant with respect and warmth. And I'm approach Saudi Arabia's journey in recent months and years with a optimism of Saudi Arabia's move to achieving its Vision 2030. And I think many of the issues that we'll be examining and that are around are necessary for Saudi Arabia to get a clear understanding of if they're going to pursue those ends. What, for my years overseas and abroad, what matters to me more than anything else, and it actually characterizes my domestic politics as well, is my fundamental belief of people everywhere to be able to live, work, and worship as they wish. And I believe that no people and no nation can actually achieve its objectives and fulfill its purpose without ensuring that. And Saudi Arabia is on that journey. And we've seen many positive movements. I mean, just as recently as July, the Council of Ministers in Saudi Arabia promulgated landmark amendments removing the male guardianship laws that constrain many of the actions of women. And so I'm hoping to learn a great deal and be able to learn from Layla and Crispin. So thank you very much for listening and appointing me to this panel.
Everyone, thank you very much. Can I invite Tim Maloney to make some introductory remarks?
Certainly, thank you, Crispin. I'm just going to focus, if I can, on the legal aspects in relation to the particular subjects of this review panel, because as Crispin has explained, there have been a number of concerns expressed as to the terms of the detention of the subjects of this review panel. And those concerns have been expressed by the lawyers of Prince Muhammed bin Nayef, Human Rights Watch and others. And they centre on the potential that basic standards relating to detention, international standards under, for example, the UN minimum standard rules for the treatment of prisoners, which are known as the Mandela Rules since 2015, and the Arab Charter on Human Rights, as well as other international instruments, might not be being afforded to the detainees with whom we're concerned at present. Now, the key concerns that have been expressed focus on 4 areas. Firstly, that they might be detained without charge. That would be in breach of all international human rights standards, as is obvious. And Muhammed bin Nayef's lawyers report that he's been detained without charge since his arrest on the 6th of March 2020, which is some 7 months now, obviously. And those reports follow allegations that he was under a prolonged period of house arrest since June 2017. And it's also unclear whether or not Prince Ahmed bin Abdul Aziz has been charged. There's certainly no reports of his charge since the detention in March of this year. Secondly, that the location of their detention is not known. Under UN human rights standards, any prisoner has the right for his location to be known to their family or other persons, and the location of detention for Prince Muhammed bin Nayef is allegedly unknown to his family. Thirdly, concerns about the denial of healthcare. Rules 24 to 35 of the Mandela Rules require that adequate healthcare is given to prisoners. The concern that has been expressed by the lawyers of Prince Muhammed bin Nayef is that he's been denied access to his doctor since his arrest in March, and it's unclear whether he's been given sufficient medical care for his diagnosed diabetes. Fourthly and finally, there are concerns about the extent that the detainees are able to communicate from their place of detention. The UN Commission on Human Rights has observed that prolonged incommunicado detention can, in certain circumstances, amount to inhuman and degrading treatment, and questions have been raised about the possibility that both Muhammed bin Nayef and Ahmed bin Abdul Aziz have had very limited communication with their family, and the more recent reports suggest that the communication is continually reducing. So those are the main areas that the detention review panel will be focusing on: the detention without charge, the lack of knowledge of the location, concerns about the denial of healthcare, and the concerns about their ability to communicate. And that will be an investigative process, as said by Crispin and Layla and Imran, essentially taking a fair-minded view in relation to the evidence that comes forward. And with that, can I hand over to my colleague, Ide Dijkstal, who will explain the process for moving that forward.
Thank you, Tim. So what I'm going to review is what the panel can achieve and the way forward. The first steps for the panel is to receive evidence, investigate, analyze this information, and make conclusions in a report. Therefore, the panel is officially receiving evidence on the situation in relation to the political prisoners in Saudi Arabia, and in particular, as mentioned, receiving and reviewing all evidence of the situation of the detention of Crown Prince Muhammed bin Nayef and Prince Ahmed bin Abdul Aziz, and any alleged human rights violations as reviewed by Tim. So please note that any evidence should be sent to Bindmans at the following email address, and that's t.ali@bindmans.com. So once the panel has reviewed and analyzed the evidence received, it will issue a report with conclusions in relation to the conditions, the status, the treatment of the political prisoners, and will make recommendations in regards to these conclusions with the aim of highlighting any potential human rights violations that might be found for possible recourse by the Saudi government. Recommendations in the report could include steps for remedying any violations, or could even go so far as to further suggest issuing sanctions by the UK government. And this is exampled by the UK government's recent sanctions in July of Saudi individuals bearing direct responsibility for the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and could include asset freezing or a travel ban. The report and its conclusions could also, after being issued, be raised with UN bodies and national governments. And this depends on the conclusions and the recommendations based on the evidence that is received. But here are some of the options that could be pursued as far as using the panel's report. It could be raised before the UN General Assembly or the UN Human Rights Council. It could also be raised during the UN's Universal Periodic Review procedure, whereby the UN Human Rights Council periodically reviews states' compliance with their human rights obligations. It could also be analyzed whether, based on the evidence and the findings of the panel, a communication could be made to the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which requests the working groups to make a finding on the detention of the political prisoners and whether that detention can be deemed arbitrary under the legal definitions before the Working Group for Arbitrary Detention. The panel could also assess the possibility of engaging with UN special rapporteurs to raise any particular findings within the special rapporteur's periodic reports to the General Assembly and the UN Human Rights Council. And last, another option that could be considered is engagement with the Committee Against Torture. And although Saudi Arabia, as a member state to the Convention Against Torture, has lodged a reservation against the committee's ability to examine information it receives about allegations of torture, the committee is still able to conduct a periodic review every 4 years of the government's compliance with the convention, and so submissions could possibly be made based on the findings of the report to the committee for it to consider during that periodic review. So that is just a list of some of the options that could be considered as a way forward once that report is issued, and will be considered, of course, based on the evidence received and the findings that are made by the panel. Thank you.
Adi and Tim, thank you very much indeed for the summary of the legalities around this. And of course, the three of us politicians on this panel will rely for the legal authority on the advice we have, and to have lawyers from both Doughty Street Chambers and 33 Bedford Row, who, and for them to be masterminded by Bindmans being brought together, those names themselves, their international reputation, speak volumes about the importance of the rule of law and justice within the British system, and the reputation of those chambers and those solicitors' partnership bringing all of this together. Will give a huge authority to the work that we do. So we are approaching this with all due seriousness, properly advised, for this to be a piece of work which people can rely on, as I believe the first two panels were. And when we reviewed the detention conditions of President Mohammed Morsi, and enjoyed the advice of Tim Mullaney on that, tragically, we identified the awful conditions in which he was being held, and we predicted the wretched outcome that then happened to him. And we did point out that the conditions of detention he was in could amount to the crime of torture, and did point out that torture is a crime of universal jurisdiction. So these are immensely important matters. And I would hope that the authorities in Saudi Arabia will cooperate with us and give us the opportunity then to be the authoritative vehicle by which they can tell a much, much better story than is otherwise being told around Saudi Arabia and the management of its own politics. And so on that note of hope, I now invite people to put questions to the panel. I hope that our statements and the statement we put out with the press release and everything else is so thoroughly comprehensive to the attendees that no questions will be necessary, but we are now available to you. And I hope that I'm going to be able to see the questions if they're then typed into the into the chat. So over to the attendees, if you have any questions. Because you should note, I can't see you in these circumstances that we have. And if we have been utterly comprehensive, we will all go on our way rejoicing. But
if they have questions afterwards, Crispin, what should they do?
Then that is I invite Gozia, who is managing this side of matters for us, to advise me on that in the chat or directly. I think email inquiries to Bindmans is the to Bindmans and Bindmans press office would be right. But I suspect all three of us panelists are easily obtainable by any journalist worth their salt, and we can be contacted directly. I know my defence mechanisms are relatively weak from journalist inquiries, so we'll be only too happy to engage with people who are interested in what I think is the very important work we're doing. Right. Well, are there any? If there are no questions, therefore, huge thanks to my fellow panelists for the ground that you have covered. We are obviously at the first stage of this. It's really the laying out of the ground and announcing all this, and we will have more to say, I hope, which will in the near future. But much that will depend on the engagement of the Saudi authorities, and we're ready to be examined by the ambassador here collectively if he chooses to do so. I know there's an option he is certainly considering. He wasn't able to do this week because of the incoming visit by the Saudi Commerce Minister. And I look forward to the next weeks in which we get engaged in this very important work. And if there are no questions right now, we look forward to receiving inquiries or being able to publish our work and have it properly and fairly reported by those who have attended this afternoon's press conference. So just means to say thank you very much for Bindmans Press Office for setting up organisation of this, and to Tim and ID for your time in supporting us three politicos who will look forward to all the work that's going to be done on our behalf, particularly by people who are going to submit evidence to us. And here, if I can just finish on that note, we are inviting evidence from anyone who thinks they have lockers on not only these two very high-profile detainees in Saudi Arabia, but really all political detainees in Saudi Arabia, and the context for us to learn around from other people's points of view around how this is done. And that obviously we invite contributions from all perspectives. So thank you very much indeed for everybody's attendance this afternoon. And I call this press conference to close.